What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and let's talk about a huge balance update that was just levied on Warhammer 40k unexpectedly this morning. This update saw huge changes to some core abilities, as well as some very common abilities that were found around factions, as well as enormous reworks for factions like Genestealer cults, Space Marines, and Adepta Sororitas. That Space Marine one is going to be huge, and that's going to be a lot of what we talk about today. But let's dive in and talk about the biggest changes that occurred on this balance data slate update that you have to be aware of for your games of Warhammer 40k. First off, some core rules changes. Fire Overwatch has had a slight change applied to it. It now activates when a unit declares a charge. Previously, it could be used on normal moves, advances, falls backs, or charges when those moves are started or ended. Now, it works on the normal moves, advances, and falling back just as it did previously. You can use them at the start or the end of those moves as normal during your opponent's movement phase. However, in the charge phase, it can only be used in response to a unit declaring that they wish to charge another unit. This is different than the previous version because previously it required you to begin a charge move to use the Fire Overwatch stratagem, meaning that a charge roll had to be successful and you were fired at either at the beginning of that move or at the end. You could potentially fire into melee with it at the end of a charge if, for example, someone charged in with a vehicle. You could still use the big guns never tire rolls to fire into melee with vehicles, even though vehicles were not able to fire out of melee in the same way using Fire Overwatch. It was a little confusing, and it's been cleaned up now. Now, if your opponent declares that they want to charge you, you can Overwatch them, full stop. That's it. That's the only timing you can use it in the charge phase, and you do it before you see what the charging unit rolls. Next up, we have some changes to some abilities and effects that are common in many factions in the game. The first one is Armor of Contempt style stratagems. Stratagems that reduce armor penetration characteristics. These are things like the aforementioned Armor of Contempt. There are stratagems like these in, I would say, most factions in the game, and every single detachment in the Space Marine Codex has one. They've been kind of ubiquitous throughout the edition, and they've been one of the reasons that 10th edition ends up being very defensive, because you can stack basically permanent access to cover with these armor penetration characteristic debuffs and other defensive stratagems like smokescreen to make your big tanky models much harder to kill. This has been deemed to be too powerful, so Armor of Contempt stratagems, any stratagem that on targeting reduces the armor penetration characteristic of an incoming attack, only works for that attacking unit's activation. So if you are declared as the target of an attack, you can use Armor of Contempt, but if you do so, it will not affect the attacks of any other units for that phase, unlike the previous version where these would affect a unit for the entirety of a phase. So you could use Armor of Contempt, be shot at by something small, maybe to set up a combo from your opponent, and then that would affect every single other unit that targets that unit that the stratagem is being used on. That's no longer the case. Now it only affects the unit who is currently attacking you. This makes stratagems like these still useful at blocking big attacks from specific enemies, but less good at making you harder to kill over the length of a phase, and in my opinion is a great change. Next up, 3-inch deep strikes have been entirely removed from the game. They're just gone now. Any stratagem that allowed you to deep strike outside 3 inches of an opponent rather than the normal 9 inches or arrive from reserve 3 inches away, for example, those have all been increased to 6 inches. So these are stratagems like prognosticated arrival from Grey Knights, for example. In addition, every instance of a 3-inch deep strike elsewhere in the game has been moved to a 6-inch deep strike, and if it is on a unit's datasheet as an ability, it only works in your movement phase. So now, instead of being able to rapid ingress 3 inches away from enemies, units like Trigons or Inceptors can only come in out of reserve during your turn 6 inches away from enemies. They can rapid ingress normally, the normal 9 inches, but they won't be able to use abilities like Meteoric Descent outside of that movement phase. This is a huge deal for armies and units that are relying on those close deep strikes in order to perform secondaries or steal objectives. They're still probably good at taking secondaries and delivering shots on target, but they're way worse at stealing objectives from your opponent, and you now no longer need to bubble up the center of an objective in order to prevent enemies from jumping onto it. You still have to consider things like moves after deep strikes and things like that, so there are still going to be situations where you have to overprotect your objectives from being stolen, but 3-inch deep strikes are no longer one of them. So with that, let's move on to faction-specific updates. Chaos Knights have gotten a very slight rework. Their army ability is now always active. Previously, it had 2 modes. It would start as a Despair aura that reduced the Battle Shock or leadership tests within 12 inches of your Chaos Knights, and then progress to a Doom and Darkness aura that also gave you +1 to wound battle shocked enemies and gave them -1 to hit you. Now both of those effects are always in play. In order to combo with this, we saw some changes to their enhancements inside their Praetors Lance detachment as well. This includes the Traitor's Mark enhancement, which used to force a battle shock check at the start of the fight phase, now allows you in your movement phase to select a unit within 12 inches of the enhanced model and force them to take a battle shock check during that movement phase. A big update for this one. It also got a slight points decrease, so huge update for Chaos Knights, especially inside their Praetors Lance. Similarly, the Ork Wa has been reworked on its timing. Previously, Ork Was were declared at the start of a battle round, a timing which made them very clunky to use, especially if the Ork player was going second. Their opponent basically got to operate with full knowledge of whether or not the Wa was in play, and the Ork player had to declare it preemptively. So in some situations, the Ork player could declare a Wa and the other player could just move out of threat range and the Wa would be wasted. It was kind of a mess and made orcs very dependent on going first. Now it is simply declared in your command phase and lasts until your next command phase. Easy peasy, done. The downside is that you can't use it defensively on your opponent's turn in order to give you an invulnerable save or improved melee stats if they're coming to try to fight you, but it does give you much more control over when it's being used, which I think is generally going to be more powerful. This is a huge buff to orc armies. We also saw some specific detachments being updated. Tyranids specifically got a pretty sizable buff to their Assimilation Swarm detachment. This is the detachment that focuses on harvester units like Psychophages and Pyrovores and heals units around them. Previously, it required those harvesters to control an objective in order to heal and would heal for D3 wounds. Now it heals for D3+1 wounds and can be used even if you're not controlling an objective. In combination with this, Norn Assimilators also got the harvester keyword as well. So these guys are going to be able to use all of the harvester synergies within the detachment. They're also going to be able to potentially heal themselves or others within an aura every turn. And given the fact that they have a pretty sizable melee profile, they can be one of the melee payoffs for the detachment. This may put this detachment into the conversation with other popular Tyranid detachments like Invasion Fleet or Synaptic Nexus moving on into the future. Necrons also saw some slight detachment changes. Annihilation Legion got a small AP buff to shooting attacks, allowing you to buff your shooting destroyer types, whereas previously the detachment basically only focused on the melee destroyers or flayed ones, which didn't really make sense given that a lot of the destroyer profiles are ranged oriented. Hypercrypt Legion also got a slight nerf, reducing the number of units that can teleport with it every turn. We also saw some very minor datasheet changes in other factions. Adeptus Custodes were a big beneficiary of these, with a huge rework to their Vertus Praetors. Basically across the board, Vertus Praetors got +1 AP and damage, and in some cases additional strength and twin linked on their ranged weapons. Their Hurricane Bolters going up to AP 1 and 2 damage. Their Salvo Launchers going up to strength 10, AP 3, D6 +1 damage with twin linked. These damage improvements are insane. They also across the board got +1 toughness and wounds, going up to toughness 7 and 5 wounds in the case of a Vertus Praetor unit, or 8 wounds in the case of a Dawn Eagle Jetbike Shield Captain. And last but certainly not least, their datasheet ability has been improved as well to work on advanced or normal moves. Previously, it only worked on advanced moves and allowed you to deal mortal wounds when moving over enemy units while advancing. However, for an expensive unit that also had very powerful ranged and melee attacks, advancing them meant you weren't using any of those ranged or melee attacks, meaning it was basically just a blank ability on their datasheet. Now being able to do it when they perform a normal move allows them to contribute both in the movement phase, shooting phase, and charge phase, and makes them much more effective of a unit. They did get a small points increase in order to make up for these huge improvements, but the datasheet in general went from being one of the most memed on in 40k to being probably very playable. Mortarion similarly got a very important ability added to his datasheet, Deep Strike. He can now fly down from the heavens anywhere 9 inches away from enemies in your reinforcement step, or he can use Rapid Ingress to drop in next to enemies. While he is a force multiplier and oftentimes will be hanging out near his other Death Guard units, this gives him the opportunity to act as a little bit of a sneaky reserve unit, and he can force your opponent to screen him out or pop up in an awkward corner or a place where you wouldn't expect him in order to wreak havoc on his enemies. Astra Militarum saw a lot of nerfs this time around. In addition to some huge points changes in the Munitorum Field Manual, we also saw some changes to Lord Solar Leontus. Lord Solar has been changed so that he now only issues orders to regiment or squadron units. He can no longer issue orders to anything in the faction. I think this change single-handedly nukes any of the remaining super heavy builds that Astra Militarum were playing with. Lord Solar was the only model in the entire faction that could issue orders to super heavies, making them 3+ ballistic skill, for example, so that their bad ballistic skill didn't cause 500 or 600 point super heavies to miss all their attacks. He was a huge force multiplier for auxiliary units like Ogrins or Bolgrin, but now cannot issue orders to those models. While I do think that Lord Solar is still going to see some play in squadron-specific lists where you're focusing on Leman Russ or Rogel Dorns, outside of those situations, you may be better off with another warlord that is maybe less expensive and can also unlock some additional warlord effects like the Tempestor Prime making your Tempestus Scions battle line. That said, Astra Militarum are staring down the barrel of a brand new codex in a couple of weeks, so I don't know how long these changes are going to stay on the books. And with that, let's move on to some faction reworks. Adepta Sororitas are the first one. This faction was the recipient of enormous nerfs. This is riding on the coattails of huge nerfs back in October when the faction saw a points hike that made them dramatically more expensive. And while they still continue to see points hikes, we also saw a total rework of their Miracle Dice mechanic. Now, Miracle Dice are generated for Adepta Sororitas armies at the start of each battle round and at the end of each phase if one or more Sororitas units from your army were destroyed that phase. Previously, they generated a Miracle Dice every turn, and each time a unit was destroyed, so this probably cuts in half or more the number of Miracle Dice a Sororitas army was generating. And it punishes Sororitas armies that play hyper aggressively as well. If you expose the majority of your army to your opponent and they kill a bunch of units in one phase, you're only getting 1 Miracle Dice from that, not 1 for each unit. The Triumph of St. Catherine, well, it has been misspelled slightly in the Dataslate update, has had a minor change as well. It now changes the Miracle Dice you get at the start of the battle round from a random number to a 6 instead of adding a new Miracle Dice of a 6 to your poll. This makes the Miracle Dice mechanic much more random, which is likely how it should be, and gives you access to a reasonable number of Miracle Dice, whereas in the previous incarnation of the rule, you basically had an endless supply of 6s, given the fact that the Triumph was constantly handing you 6s into your Miracle pool. You had the opportunity to roll 6s with your standard dice, and you had effects like Morphin Vol or Cherubs that could reroll Miracle Dice or recycle Miracle Dice to try to get higher numbers. Those effects are much less useful now, and you have less Miracle Dice to begin with. The downside is that the old points changes that were levied on the faction based on those previous Miracle mechanics are still in place, so Adepta Sororitas may struggle for the remainder of the season. Bringers of the Flame, their aggressive, short-range focused detachment, has also been heavily nerfed. Previously, it added +1 strength to ranged weapons when attacking within 12 inches. That range has been reduced to 6 inches. We also see some other effects reduced to 6 inches in that detachment, such as the Rites of Fire stratagem, which gives you +1 to wound when disembarking from a transport and targeting an enemy unit on an objective. It's a lot of riders on a stratagem, and it used to work within 12 inches, but now only works if you target an enemy within 6. It also saw some CP cost increases to the Blazing Ire and Cleansing Flames stratagem as well. We did see a slight buff to Adepta Sororitas, though. The Desperate for Redemption detachment rule for the Penitent Host detachment has had a slight update. Now it allows you to select a Vow of Atonement at the start of the battle round rather than requiring you to do so. These Vows of Atonement are once per game abilities, of which you have 3, and previously they would burn themselves out by the end of battle round 3. You had to select one each round, and you could not select one twice, so by the end of that 3rd battle round, you didn't have a detachment rule anymore. That was probably unintended, but made the detachment super bad, and has been repaired. Genestealer cults have gotten something like the 3rd or 4th rework to their cult ambush rule. The rule has basically from the ground up been entirely rewritten, so let's break it down. The new version of the rule, instead of rolling dice to see whether or not your unit reanimates itself thanks to cult ambush when it is destroyed, instead allows itself to be repurchased from a pool of a resource called Resurgence Points. You start with a number of Resurgence Points based on the points value of the game. A standard Strike Force game of 40k is going to generate you 10 Resurgence Points, and you can spend to reanimate units from that pool based on the cost of the unit out of a special chart. Aberrants cost 5 or 8 points depending on the size of the unit. Acolyte Hybrids and Hybrid Metamorphs cost 2 or 4 Resurgence Points based on the size. And Adelan Jackals, Neophyte Hybrids, and Pure Strain Genestealers cost 3 or 6 depending on their size. These points are a limited pool, so once spent when that unit is destroyed, they are removed from the pool permanently. However, like the previous version of Cult Ambush, when you do so, you add an identical unit back into your army that gets placed into strategic reserves. The new Cult Ambush arrival arrival mechanics are specified as a type of strategic reserves. They also place a cult ambush marker down, which has also been specified as being a 32mm circle. And when that unit arrives back on the battlefield, it can do so at the end of your opponent's movement phase next to the cult ambush marker, or using any of the other normal strategic reserve rules. However, it cannot be targeted by rapid ingress. So how this works is that you can either choose to bring it as a form of rapid ingress at the end of your opponent's movement phase on a cult ambush marker, as if it were kind of a teleport homer, or you can bring it off of a table edge outside your opponent's deployment zone on battle round 2, or off of any table edge on battle round 3, and wholly within 6 inches of the side, as per the normal strategic reserve rules. However, if it has deep strike, like basically every infantry in the faction has, it can use the deep strike mechanics. So the old version of cult ambush that had a strange deep strike-esque variety of cult ambush arrival has been removed, because you can simply use this normal strategic reserve rules to deep strike your units if they have the deep strike ability. Basically, when your units cult ambush, they just go into strategic reserve instead of doing another weird reserve-esque thing. And if you want to rapid ingress them, it's free, but you have to come in next to your cult ambush marker. Now, alongside that, we also saw a nerf to the Outlander Claw detachment. This used to double the OC value of vehicles and mounted units, now simply adds 1 to their OC value. The Kelomorph has also been slightly nerfed, now triggering its reactive fire within 9 inches rather than 12. However, every demolition charge in the faction has been buffed with an extra 2 inches of range, now it being able to be thrown 8 inches rather than the previous 6. And with that, let's move on to Space Marines, which are gonna be a whole trip. The Space Marine Oath of Moment has been changed. Now, in addition to rerolling your hit rolls against the target of your Oath of Moment, if you do not include any Black Templars, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Deathwatch, or Space Wolves models, any of the models from a non-compliant chapter, you also gain +1 to wound against that target as well. Now, important to note, this doesn't mean that your chapter can't be Black Templars, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Deathwatch, or Space Wolves. You simply can't have any of their unique units in your army. So even if you wanted to play, let's say, Liberator, Strike Force, or Champions of Russ, you can still do that. However, if you want to benefit from the +1 to wound, you have to leave all the special faction units at home. However, as we'll discuss, a lot of the compliant chapter units have been buffed, making compliant chapters maybe the way to play Space Marines in the future. We did see a slight nerf to the Gladius Task Force detachment, which has probably been a long time coming. The Fire Discipline enhancement, in addition to granting sustained hits, used to grant 5+ critical hits, when in the Devastator Doctrine, giving units with lethal hits and sustained hits and that improved critical absolutely wild damage output when the army was benefiting from Devastator Doctrine. Now, instead, that 5+ critical effect has been removed. You can now just reroll advance rolls made for the unit instead. Huge debuff to Gladius Task Force. It means that this big ranged brick that was basically ubiquitous inside the detachment is probably no longer the case. I don't think that this enhancement is particularly strong for its immense points value. However, given how ubiquitous it was in Space Marine armies, that's probably for the best. There have also been some weapon and datasheet changes that affect almost every variety of Space Marine. This includes Predator Annihilators. This change affects every single Predator Annihilator datasheet in the game. This includes Chaos Space Marine, Predator Annihilators, and all of the cult varieties like Thousand Suns or Death Guard Annihilators. They've traded their reroll 1s on damage for full damage rerolls against monsters and vehicles. Kind of a nice quality of life change, but whether or not it will change whether we see Annihilators versus Destructors on the table remains to be seen. Astartes Combat Knives across all variety of Loyalist Astartes gained +1 AP, so this affects things like Reavers and Space Marine Scouts. In addition, other units got some spot improvements. This includes Heavy Intercessors and Gravis Captains gaining improved damage, Infernus Marines receiving extra AP and applying a Battle Shock penalty on the Battle Shock chest that they force. Intercessor squads double their bolter shots when concentrating fire on a single target. Outrider squads have improved strength and damage when charging. Reavers gain an aura that reduces enemy objective control characteristic nearby them in place of applying Battle Shock penalties. However, the Battle Shock tests that they force now has a Battle Shock penalty built in. And Sternguard veterans got a huge buff, full wound rerolls instead of their previous rerolls of 1 when targeting their Oath target. For a unit with a ton of devastating wound weapons, this is absolutely crazy. Now moving on to some chapter specific stuff, Codex compliant epic heroes got a huge buff in the form of the Inspiring Commander mechanic. Now most non-Ultramarine epic heroes in the Space Marine Codex provide an objective control characteristic boost to their favored unit type. This includes Darneth Lysander, improving the objective control of Terminator Assault Squads and Terminator Squads, Ironfather Fieros, improving the OC value of Heavy Intercessor Squads, Kaven Shrike, improving the OC value of Assault Jump Pack Intercessors, Corsaro Khan, improving the OC value of Outriders, Pedro Cantor, doing so for Stern Guard Veterans, and Vulcan Heston, having the same effect for Infernus Squads. This is a nice quality of life change for the non-Ultramarine compliant chapters, but to be honest, I don't know how effective it's going to be. The most exciting one to me in here is Kaven Shrike, because Jump Pack Assault Intercessors are already a very good utility unit, and making them OC2 makes them absolutely incredible at taking objectives. Not to mention the fact that Kaven Shrike is just a good unit to have to begin with. But that's not to say that Ultramarines didn't get anything. Robute Gilliman got a huge update to his Author of the Codex ability. At the start of your command phase, he now selects 2 Author of the Codex abilities. These are things like his OC bonus, his selection of 2 Oath targets rather than 1, or his aura that discounts the cost of stratagems. Both of those abilities are in effect until the start of your next command phase, making this guy incredibly good at force multiplying, especially given the fact that Ultramarines get that +1 to wound bonus against both of the Oath targets that he selects. However, he did get a very hefty points increase to go along with that. So that's compliant chapters taken care of. Now let's talk about non-compliant chapters. Dark Angel saw some changes to their Company of Hunters detachment. In addition to giving your army advance or fall back and shoot, it also now gives mounted units the ability to advance, fall back, and charge as well. Huge buff for that one. The enhancement that previously allowed units to fall back and charge now allows them to reroll advance and charge rolls instead. And Samael, already granted advance and charge to the unit he attaches to, now improves advance and charges for that unit if the unit can already advance and charge. So he either gives you the ability to do so, but if you already have it, then he'll give you +1 to your rolls. Ravenwing Black Knights also got a huge damage improvement in melee, gaining devastating wounds to go along with their anti-monster or anti-vehicle on the charge. Although idiosyncratically, command squads don't have the same rider, so while they have the exact same melee weapon profile, theirs has not been updated to gain devastating wounds. So if you have an attached command squad, you're going to have a couple models with Black Knight combat weapons that are strictly worse than the ones on the rest of the unit. Lionel Johnson also got a slight improvement of increased damage on his sweep attack, so he can now sweep with 16 attacks at strength 6 AP 3 for 2 damage and sustained hits 1, although as a downside, he did also get a pretty hefty points increase to go alongside that. And those are the biggest changes in the December 2024 Warhammer 40k balance data slate. There have been some other very minor reworks inside these documents in order to bring abilities and rules in line with some of the changes that have been made. However, those are the biggest ones. Let me know down in the comment section which changes in this document are your favorite and how you feel about this balance update. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.